I am Mike Leamy, and I'm a professor here at the law school. It's hard to believe that this is finishing up year 2. I know probably less faces than Professor Devlin, simply because what I'm doing is business classes, right? At law school, we're focusing a lot on, in these classes, the intersection of law and business, but there's much more focus on the business application. So if we're going to talk about business ethics, for better or worse, I'm your guy. All right, so tonight what we're going to do for an agenda is we're going to look at, first and foremost, what is ethics? Pretty straightforward. I think I was asked to deliver the definition of ethics because I was following Professor Devlin. No judgment, no questions asked, but I'm just doing what I was told to do. And then we're going to move on to why business ethics are important. And it's going to sound silly, right? But there's a difference between business ethics and ethics. And we'll talk about that just briefly and a little as we set the stage. And then we'll walk on to what are some common ethical issues in business. And we'll take a look at some examples, how they come into play, and how they build upon, understanding your own personal values, and then what your company defines as kind of your ethics that you need to abide by. We will talk about moral disengagement. You've got kind of an informal set of this is what it means. I think one of the definitions was psycho mumbo jumbo. Was that it, Joe? Close, right? Got it. Nailed it. I'll give you a little bit more of a textbook definition, but we'll talk about why it's important because that really kind of builds on what's at the heart of the Weston case study. And at that point, I literally am just going to walk you through kind of most of the important facts in the case. And that'll kind of segue us into a discussion with Professor Rodriguez, where he'll walk you a little bit more in depth, might focus on some of the key points a little bit deeper and reintroduce some that aren't there, but really just kind of set the framework. Ethics by themselves. Ethics refers to a set of principles or moral guidelines that govern what is considered right and wrong behavior. Seems pretty straightforward so far, right? It provides a framework for individuals and groups to make decisions based on values such as honesty, fairness, and respect for others. Again, first couple of points here in my first slide, right, is something that could have also been translated in an elementary school. Speaks to it's pretty basic, right, but it's crazy how quickly we can go from a basic, seemingly simple concept to moral disengagement. But we're going to get there. Ethics can vary across cultures and contexts, but generally aim to promote integrity and responsible conduct. Again, seems super simple, right? Look at that last sentence and just stop and process. That should be really easy, right? Ethics are ethics. We have our personal values. I'm going to point to cultures and context. We think that plays a little bit of a role. So just think about these two things, right? If I am here in the United States, right, and I'm bidding for a contract and I were to go to a person and say, hey, I've got some great box seats to the Sox game tonight. Well, maybe tonight's not the right night to go to a Sox game, right? But theoretically, and you know what, I can't use them. Why don't you take your family and you go? Seems like it might be a form of a bribe, right? Remove our culture and our context, and in other international interests, it's the expectation, right? That gift giving is a part of building the relationship. So we haven't even walked off the first slide, and we've all agreed that it's really simple and easy, right? There shouldn't be any psycho mumbo jumbo. But all we've done is change where we're operating, and it's easy to see how this can get a little bit convoluted. And this is just when we're looking at our own personal ethics, what you and I choose to believe. What I say or what I think might be different than what Lee thinks and how he acts. But usually we're at least stemmed in the same integrity. All right, so let's say, how does this differ with business ethics? Business ethics refers to the moral principles and guidelines that govern the actions and decisions of businesses and individuals in the business environment. All right, so collectively, we probably don't all agree on exactly the same thoughts and principles of how we're going to conduct ourselves. But collectively as a group, we're going to need to do so. So it involves considering not only what is legally permissible, but also what is morally right and just in conducting business activities, especially if we leave our culture and context. How are we as a company going to represent ourselves and our stakeholders? Policies and procedures regarding topics such as fraud, bribery, discrimination, and corporate governance. Corporate governance becomes an important piece that we're going to talk about a little bit later when we talk about some of the examples. What that is taking all of this together, creating this structure that says this is how we as an institution or as an organization are going to operate and how we're going to abide. So far, pretty clean, straightforward, right? All right, so let's go into why are they important. Helps us navigate the gray of what is right and what is wrong. Triple bottom line. Anyone heard the term before? Profit, profit, profit. Does that sound right? Theoretically, right, if you're looking at just the fiduciary duty, maybe profit, profit, profit is right. The new age definition of the triple bottom line is profit, people, and planet, right? So profit is just that. You have a fiduciary responsibility. We have to increase the wealth of the shareholder, right? That's one piece of it. If we're doing people, there's a social responsibility. We want to make sure that we're doing right by our stakeholders, but by people in general. And you don't have to look, those of you who have had class with me before know that I have a financial background, right? And we talk a lot about investing in mutual funds and different pieces there. There's a whole industry of mutual funds built on just that, right? You can see funds that are as concentrated on social justice. You can see funds that are green funds focused on companies that invest in the planet. So these are important pieces. The third one being planet is environmental, right? We have to be aware of that. Today, probably more so than ever. You know, when Professor Devlin referenced going back to like our grandparents' generation and a couple generations before, it wasn't even a thought. And I'm not saying for all folks, but in general, it really wasn't. I grew up in a city on the Nashua River, Fitchburg, Massachusetts. You could tell what color paper was being made in the paper mills because that's what the color of the river was. Right? That's not that long ago. Thankfully now that you would have to go in to know what kind of paper, but soon enough no one's going to be using paper anymore anyway. But it's just tells you this is in one lifetime how far we've come. So what are some of the common issues? Conflict of interest is when personal interests interfere with professional duties, such as favoring a family member or friend in business dealings. This will feature prominently in our case study, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Pretty straightforward. Corporate governance, ensuring that the company is governed effectively with transparency and accountability to shareholders and stakeholders. This one I want to just share a little bit of an example. Apple does a really good job of spelling out their corporate governance. And as we get to examples, I'll talk a little bit about Apple, is that they're unique in that they have two guiding principles about all of their suppliers. They must treat people fairly, and they must be environmentally friendly. And they're very crystal clear about this, right? But if you think about the industry that Apple works in, they have been flagged more than once for concerns of dealing with child labor laws. That kind of works directly against treating people fairly, right? So what I'm saying, sharing this, not accusing anyone of anything, just saying it's really tricky. Ethics and business ethics and practice look like such a clean, simple thing to deal with until you're in the moment and you're realizing, as Professor Devlin said, right, you're employees, employees, employees. And when you start to get to folks that are tied to but you don't have a direct relationship with, it gets really tricky to manage all of this. But you have to be aware of it and set these standards. Discrimination. Again, pretty straightforward, treating individuals unfairly based on characteristics such as race, gender, or age in hiring, promotion, or other business practices. Right. Common issues, but again, things that pop up on a pretty regular basis. We have environmental responsibility, addressing the impact of business activities on the environment, including pollution, resource depletion, and climate change. Probably, maybe one of the biggest things that's going on in our conversations today when it comes to ethics. Right? We talked about the green funds that are coming. We've talked about renewable energies. I don't think no one's lived in a time where there's more of a focus on being efficient and of the resources that we have. Labor practices, ensuring fair wages, safe working conditions, and respect for labor rights for all employees. Privacy, protecting customer and employee information from unauthorized use or disclosure. For me, this is kind of first and foremost. The privacy issue and what has changed thanks to a lot of the devices that we welcome into our own house now, right? That is a major concern for individuals, and it's equally a major concern for organizations. The retention of, the keeping of, the sharing of information. That is that, if it's not on your radar as something to at least be aware of, both personally and professionally, it should be something that's on your radar. Product safety, ensuring that products are safe for consumers and meet relevant quality standards. I want to say, give or take, about a decade ago, I was talking in a course on business ethics, and we were talking about a company who created airbags for cars. Again, ethics should be really straightforward and really simple, right? Imagine you're overseeing the production of airbags, and you find out that they are not performing and could result in the death of people who have these airbags in their car. Simple, quick answer. What should you do? Recall, right? We would hope it's that simple. In this case study that we were talking about, it was found that a person in a management position found out and asked them to do the cost of what would be the cost of the recall versus the cost of the litigations for anything that they were sued for. That is horrifying, right? Because it's not just the financial dollar for dollar. Those costs are the results of people dying. They found out or believed that from their analysis, they would be better off to not do the recall and to actually make the payments of all these claims. Again, horrifying, also inaccurate. What I can tell you is now that company, not a US-based company, but it no longer, they had to file for bankruptcy, as you would hope to imagine to be true. It is true. Again, right? Super simple concept that it should be a no-brainer of what to do, but we've gotten to a place where people can ask that question. Whistleblowing probably should have happened in that last case that I just talked about. And social responsibility, engaging in activities that benefit society, such as charitable giving, community development, or environmental conversations or conservation. I guess it could be both. We talked a little bit about moral disengagement. I am not going to read for you word for word the definition. You have access to this. Professor Devlin gave you some really good examples that I think walked us through. This is what it is, right? What I can tell you is I don't think it's always that clean and clear of a situation. When I was in my young 20s, right, I worked for an organization where they came to us and they're like, yeah, you know, we were owned by a parent company that also owned a complex, a naming rights of a ballpark. So we were often given the opportunity to go and to sit in like the box seats, and there was all kinds of packages that came with it. It was a great thing, right? And so I'm in my young 20s thinking this is fantastic, and it was all on the up and up. Fast forward to, again, culture and context, right? When I was in my 30s, I was a financial analyst working, and it was just in the 90s, and this is kind of how business operated, and still in some industries it does, right? Fast forward to I'm in my 30s, I left that, I went into higher ed, and I'm working at a state institution. We could not receive any gift that had a value of over $50 without reporting it. Couldn't take it in general. Anything you had to report. Now, as you could imagine, going into these box seats would have probably been way over a $50 value. It's just pointing out, you know, that if you're in that environment where I was in the early 90s, right, like money's being spent, all these different things, it's probably a little bit easier to lose track of something as seemingly straightforward as a dollar value. Whereas at an institution that was run by a state organization, it was always on our radar to make sure that we're aware of what's going on. Now, in both places that I worked, things seemed to always be on the up and up. So you can exist in both of these, but you can see that if things aren't clearly defined, this becomes a little bit more of a concern. If everybody else is doing these wild and crazy things, you can lose track of what you think is normal or ethical. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the Weston case. Chris and Allison Weston are a well-educated, ambitious couple. Chris is driven and focused on expanding the scope of his role and job. It's important to note, coming up, he has just taken a new job. Allison, his wife, has dropped her career to allow Chris and the family to move. So Chris took a new job and was overwhelmed with needing to fill jobs. He had complete control over hiring and human resources. And as you read the case, you would find that it literally was not a couple of positions that needed to be filled. It was a rotating door. And there were a lot of positions immediately that needed to be filled at that moment. Important fact is that Allison had a background in staffing and human resources. Chris encouraged Allison to start a staffing resources company, looking to partner with her. I see a few heads already shaking and some smiles going, right? Real quick, you can see the laying of a foundation of a slippery slope. The company was started in Allison's maiden name to avoid potential concerns. I'm seeing Lee's eyes pop up, right? I know you've read the case, and I know that's an important piece to consider, right? In the beginning, the two generally thought that they were doing what was right to best serve the company, right? He's into a new position where they are in great need to fill jobs. His wife has a background in it. She's not currently working. She sacrificed a lot to get there. You could see the jump from, all right, I'll bring her on board to help us out. We need someone to do this job. She's capable of doing this job. Let's bring her in to do it. Here's where it starts to go. Chris saw lots of unethical and bad behavior within the organization. In the case study, he shares a story of executives joking over the value of a deceased coworker and what the payout to his family should be. If I'm remembering the exact numbers right, it was $100,000 that was going to be paid out on a policy, and an hour before having to meet with the family, he heard them joking about $50,000 would be too much to give her. Right? I think I have the numbers right. Yeah, right? Just hearing that, right, sets a tone of what the ethics and the morals and the values were in the organization. Again, not justifying anything, just saying it's really easy to take a leap from our opening slide of I could present this to a third grade class and they should understand it, to here we are with that same principle, not third graders joking about the value of a person's life. An hour before this person has to go in and meet with them. Chris sees this and starts to justify his own actions. Like Professor Devlin said, compared to what I'm seeing over here, what I'm doing is not bad at all. Allison begins to overbill and charge for services when she was barely working. Important to note, Chris and Allison justify this as an additional payment for all the extra work and stress that has fallen on Chris, and believe they are still serving the company and the stakeholders. Company has the money, service that needs to be filled is being filled, in an environment where what we're doing is nowhere near as bad as what we're seeing. They often talk and believe the worst case scenario is that Chris will lose his job and then he can just leave to go and work for Allison's company. Contingency planning. Usually not a great ethical side, right? Chris leaves the organization, does go back, in fact, to work for his wife's company. The Westons admit to civil liability in a civil suit for $1.2 million without admitting criminal liability, believing that to be the clearest path to avoid jail time. They were advised to do so, okay? But 6 months later, they are sued in federal court. The takeaway here, Chris and Allison served 20 and 18 months in federal prison for mail fraud and padding invoices. So, as I said, we walk through kind of an overview of ethics, the difference between your own personal ethics, right, as well as corporate governance and defining what is ethical standards for an organization. Thank you all for your time, and if you need anything, my contact information's here.